At the 5-minute mark, we get to see the return of Lilith in the flesh, and I'm not sure what I was expecting. Hello, and welcome to the 16th edition of Frasier Fridays. Today, we're finally at the episode we've all been waiting for. The one where Lilith comes back and really tosses Frasier's salad and scrambles his eggs, even if she preferred them poached. This episode originally aired on February 3rd, 1994, and attracted a massive 33.1 million viewers. This is a huge climb of 5.3 million viewers from the previous week. This is the highest rated episode of the season and series thus far, and will remain the highest rated episode of the series for over 6 years. In fact, the only episode to beat it out in the ratings is the season 7 finale, which will rake in 600,000 more viewers. Not only is this a record holder in viewership for Frasier, it also marks the first time Frasier brought in more viewers than Seinfeld. Seinfeld comes back for the first time in a month and drops 2 million viewers from that showing, and pulls in 100,000 viewers fewer than Frasier. The intro this week is The Lights All Over the City, and the production code is 117. Next week is 115, catching us back up on production codes and episode numbers. Appropriately, the show where Lilith comes back was directed by James Burrows, who didn't actually direct the first episode of Cheers Lilith was in. That distinction fell to Thomas LaFaro, who actually only has 6 direction credits to his name, 5 of which are episodes of Cheers. Despite missing out on directing her first appearance, Burrows did direct the episode where Lilith and Frasier's romance started, so I'm glad he was the one on direction here instead of Andy Ackerman. This episode brings on Ken Levine and David Isaacs for writing duties. This is their first foray on Frasier, but it won't be their last. As a team, these two will write another 6 episodes of Frasier, and on his own, Isaacs will write a 2-parter in 1999. Like Burrows, I'm glad this pair was brought on to work on this episode. The pair are comedy writing veterans with a lot of ties to Frasier-related shows. They've written scripts for MASH, After MASH, The Tortellis, The Simpsons, Wings, Cheers, Becker, and It's All Relative. The writing team won 2 Writers Guild of America awards for episodes of Cheers and scored an Emmy nomination for this very episode. Today, Levine is a cartoonist for New York Magazine, and Isaac is a professor and chair of the writing division of the University of Southern California. He teaches a comedy and screenwriting class. This team will return for the episode where Sam comes back. We're back to the standard Frasier formula of starting an episode with the guest caller scene this week, and using it to propel the storyline forward. We have 2 callers this week. The first is Timothy Leary. Leary has actually done his fair share of television appearances, but that's not all he's known for. Much like Jay Leno and Dr. Joyce Brothers, the majority of Leary's appearances have been as himself. He showed up in movies and television shows, including Wes Craven's Shocker, Blossom, The Adventures of Briscoe County Jr., and a Harry Nilsson music video. Leary is best known as a psychologist who widely studied the use of psychedelics. This led to him being arrested 36 times, and President Richard Nixon declaring him, quote, the most dangerous man in America, unquote. Leary coined the term, turn on, tune in, drop out. There's a heck of a lot more that could be said about Leary. He had a wide and sweeping influence in his field and in the counterculture movements of the 60s and 70s, and he holds a pretty unique place in both the pop culture and psychological zeitgeist, and is someone I think both Frasier and Lilith would be genuinely excited to talk to, even if they don't agree with all of his viewpoints. Our second guest caller, and very special guest star, is Bebe Neuwirth, as Frasier's ex-wife Lilith. Neuwirth's journey to the role of the ex-Mrs. Crane is kind of interesting. Neuwirth was drawn to stage acting from a young age, and wanted to be a Broadway actress early on. By her early 20s, she was a member of the Princeton Ballet Company, and in 1980, at just 21 years old, she made her Broadway debut. She was quite successful on Broadway, and in 1985, while in LA accepting a Tony Award, she did a few television auditions. One of them was for the one-off role of Lilith Sternin. The role of Lilith was nearly her first appearance on television. In fact, she missed it being her first role by only an hour and a half. Her first televised appearance was on an episode of Simon and Simon, which aired the same night as her first Cheers appearance, but in the 8 p.m. time slot, whereas Cheers aired at 9:30. The character was so well liked, Neuwirth would go on to appear in 80 episodes of Cheers and an episode of Wings. She has appeared in a lot of other TV shows and movies since, including the original Jumanji, All Dogs Go to Heaven, Will and Grace, Madam Secretary, and Sabrina the Teenage Witch. In her free time, Neuwirth is known for her involvement in a Dancer's Resource program and her work with horse rescue. The only reason Lilith's call gets through is because Roz wanted to see what Frasier would say. And to be fair, I did too. Frasier and Roz have a nice silent exchange while they're broadcasting via notes. Roz surprised me a little here. She holds up a note telling Frasier he can't fire her because she's in a union. I didn't realize there was a radio broadcasters union, so I had to do a little digging. There's actually quite a few possibilities for which radio workers union she could be in. My first guess would be Roz is a member of the UE, or the Union for Everyone, which is actually not for everyone, but is instead a union for electrical, radio, and machine workers. It was founded in Pittsburgh in 1936. The only problem with this assumption is I'm not sure it extended as far west as Washington. The other possibility, which I like quite a bit more, is she's a member of SAG-AFTRA, which stands for Screen Actors Guild, Actors, Television, and Radio Artists. Roz may ultimately be a producer, but she does talk during the show, which I think would let her fall under this banner. There's of course also the possibility she works for a smaller local union. There was a long-running joke in Cheers that Lilith was kind of a dark spirit, and that carries over to Frasier, with Daphne having strong psychic backlash from Lilith being in town. It's a cute subplot, and adds a nice bit of mysticism to Daphne's psychic abilities. We get some interesting tidbits about Lilith's interactions with the rest of the Crane family, and a new bit of timeline information on Niles and Maris's marriage. It seems Lilith was present at Niles' wedding and left quite a scar on him. Frasier and Lilith began dating in 1985, during a Season 5 episode of Cheers. And they moved in together at the end of Season 5 in February of 1986. I think it's a fair guess late 1985 is the absolute earliest Lilith and Frasier would have known each other well enough for Frasier to ask her on a trip across the country to attend his brother's wedding. This means, at the absolute most, Maris and Niles have been married for 8 years at this time. I might just be reading into something that wasn't there, but I was also under the impression Lilith and Frasier were already married at the time of Niles' wedding. This would mean, at the most, Niles has been married 5 to 6 years. Either way, it's an interesting tidbit, and the first new information we've learned about Maris since it was revealed Daphne is about a foot taller than her. At the 5-minute mark, we get to see the return of Lilith in the flesh, and I'm not sure what I was expecting. It isn't quite what we got, and I'm not upset about that. When we last saw Lilith at the end of Cheers, her and Frasier had sort of reconciled and were trying to live together after Lilith cheated and left Frasier for 6 months, before realizing she still loved him. Here, we're picking up about a year and a half after that, and a year after Frasier had moved out to Seattle. Maybe the best joke of the episode, and easily the most Lilithy one, is when Lilith tells Eddie to go away, and he quickly flees the room. It works well to show Lilith is still kind of cold, as she was in Cheers, and that she hasn't lost any of her edge when it comes to her attitude. Lilith then gives the most half-hearted apology I've ever seen to Niles, and Niles is overwhelmed by it. This is funny and is played off entirely as a joke, but it makes me wonder just what Niles' home life with Maris is like. When it came to Norm and Vera, Norm was definitely the one who was the weak link in that relationship. Given Niles' past comments and this scene, even with his shameless flirting with Daphne, I'm starting to think Maris is the norm of their relationship. The song Frasier shamelessly stole lyrics from in his letter to Lilith is Love Will Keep Us Together by the Captain and Tennille. Although the Captain and Tennille version is the most famous and popular version of this song, it's not the original. The song was written in 1973 by Neil Sedaka and Howard Greenfield. The song didn't receive a US release and ended up as a B-side on one of Sedaka's bigger hits. The brother and sister duo, Mac and Katie Kissoon, next took a stab at the song and also failed to chart in the United States, although they did reach number 12 on the Netherlands music chart. Real quick bunny trail, the X-Files theme is by a man named Mark Snow, and actually reached number 1 on the France music chart when it was released. Anyway, I just found that an interesting tidbit. 2 years after the second version of Love Will Keep Us Together was released, the Captain and Tennille version came out in 1975 and shot up the charts, landing at number 1 on both the Easy Listening and Billboard pop charts. It stayed at number 1 on the pop chart for 4 weeks. If there's any joke on this episode that reminds me of Cheers, it's the scene where Lilith tries to flee Frasier's apartment and accidentally slams her purse in the door. This is a very Rebecca Howe thing to do, but given the circumstances, it works well enough for the scene. Ultimately, Frasier and Lilith end up in bed together after Frasier comes to her hotel room to talk to her the night before. They order breakfast the next morning, and the hotel bellman brings it to them. The bellman is played by Roger Keller. Keller was a small-time actor who only had 11 roles on his resume. What's surprising about these 11 roles is nearly all of them are shows related to the Frasier cast and crew. His first appearance was in an episode of Cheers. He showed up in Wings, The Nanny, Carolyn in the City, and Murphy Brown. After Frasier accidentally admits he doesn't want to get back together with Lilith, Dr. Sternin bursts into tears. This is a much more human side of Lilith than we typically see. We saw some of these emotions from her like this at the end of Cheers when their initial separation happened, and it's nice to see that even after a year apart, Lilith still cares about Frasier. Our coda scene feels classic Frasier at this point, with Daphne's psychic headaches dissipating as soon as Lilith's plane takes off. I know Lilith is going to show up on Frasier a few more times, and I'm hoping when she does, Daphne will have a similar reaction. There is one small goof worth pointing out in this episode. It is a minor continuity issue. When Lilith's purse is stuck in the door, Frasier's shadow shows him with his hands in his pocket, while when we reverse shot back to him, we can see his hands aren't in his pockets at all. Frasier is surprisingly light on ties this episode, sporting only one tie this week, and that's a repeat, with the Thanksgiving tie. Niles beats Frasier out in tie count this week for the first time since the pilot episode, and both of Niles' ties this week are new. This red one with the white floral design is tie number 42, finally. And this very abstract one with fall coloring is number 43 for the show. This brings the totals to 19 different ties for Niles and 21 for Frasier. The return of Lilith is not exactly what I was expecting, but that's a good thing. I knew we'd have some Cheers characters start to show up in the series as it went on, and it makes sense for Lilith to be the first one of them, especially considering her history with Frasier. Since it's Frasier's show, I was expecting Lilith to be played off entirely as a villain. And that isn't the case here. Sure, she's kind of a jerk to Niles, but she does offer an apology, even if it is a half-hearted and somewhat insincere one. Frasier and Lilith's interactions are the highlights of this episode, and serve to remind exactly why I like them so much as a couple during Cheers, which is nice. This might be an unpopular opinion, but I was never that big a fan of Diane. I knew she was coming back in the finale of Cheers, and I ended up feeling a little underwhelmed by her appearance there, when we just ended up retreading her and Santa's past relationship. We do the exact same thing here, but it works for me. I think that's largely because Lilith is a much more engaging character than Diane ever was. The feel of this episode is kind of strange. Granted, it's from ex-Cheers writers and directed by James Burrows, but it ultimately ends up feeling a lot more like an episode of Cheers than Frasier. Especially with the Rebecca Howe move when Lilith slams her purse in the door. Again, not a bad thing, but also not the kind of joke Frasier is typically gone for. The cheesiness of this episode aside, I'd call this the third really strong episode in a row. It did exactly what it needed to do. Yes, it was largely focused on Lilith and Frasier, and we didn't really get to see too much of the regular cast. But that's exactly what was needed out of having Bebe Neuwirth as a guest star for the first time. If you're excited to see the return of the magnificent Sternin, settle in for this 9 out of 10 episode of Frasier.